basically the question comes up of the Iron Bank, or I guess the suggestion is made that the Iron Bank is deeply invested in the slave trade in Essos. This has been impacted heavily by the events in Marine and Slaver's Bay, where Dany has kind of tried to eradicate, and it caused a disruption. And obviously this reflects a little bit A Dance of Dragons, where Zoros Randoxos comes to Dany and mentions how the impact of what she's done has sent ripples through a lot of economies. Volantis is also bothered by the impact she's had on the slave trade, and also more by the idea that she's raised up in Volantis and elsewhere that slaves need not be slaves; they can be free. On the show, and I mean, I've seen some people argue against it. I'm not gonna watch. I don't know. I would take it from what I've been told is that because Tychonosaurus has no argument against it and seems to go along with the idea that they've been hit, but the Iron Bank on the show does have direct monetary interest in the slave trade. Now, if you go back to Braavos and you go back to the books, Braavos notes it, but it's made much more clear in The World of Ice and Fire, or the book we wrote with George, that Braavos was founded by former slaves, escaped slaves. They rebelled, they took over this fleet of ships, found this hidden lagoon, and founded a city there. And the impact of having been slaves was so large to them that their first law, and in The World of Fire, it's capitalized, first law, capital F, capital L, underscored the fact that they were a city of free men and women who had no truck with slavery whatsoever. So you can see why people are kind of, oh, the Iron Bank, wouldn't be directly involved. Now, the fact is the Iron Bank is not solely a Braavosi institution in the sense that they have an international reach. They lend money through a lot of... I don't know what the furthest east we've seen their money explicitly said to go. But we know, for example, well, it's noted that the Iron Bank would lend money to Archons and also Triarchs. So, I mean, at least as far down as Volantis, and Archons are Tyrosh, maybe elsewhere, but... And it's interesting when we talk about Volantis in particular, but Tyrosh as well, these are both quite heavily involved in the slave trade in Essos. As is 99% of Essos, and basically every other free city except Braavos. And Pentos, because, well, there was a war in which the Braavosi forced the Pentoshi to outlaw slavery. Now, as it happens, a little toothless because they still, under the table, kind of do it. They just say that they're servants or whatever, but they're actually slaves. But at least Braavos has gone to war over these things and has tried to impose its desire that other free cities don't practice slavery. And in particular, in The World of Fire, it's actually said the Sea Lords in particular have had a long history of being opposed to it. And even as recently as the books, when the slavers end up capturing women at Hardhome, women and children, they show up and they take them away, saying they'll take them to safety, and in fact then they clap chains on them and are planning to sell them. One of the ships, I believe, maybe two, ends up damaged and ends up having to put it to Braavos. And basically, the slavers are arrested and the women and children are freed because they don't do slavery. But you still have the problem that outside of the Seven Kingdoms and Braavos and kind of Pentos, most of Essos practices slavery. So even if the Iron Bank refuses, and I think I think the Iron Bank in the books does not directly fund slavery. They do not, someone can't go, hey, I want to send a ship over to get a load of slaves and I need funding for... I don't think they would do that. It's just the same as modern banks in the United States and elsewhere. There are various things they're not supposed to get involved in. And the regulations, they've been more or less successful in some times, and there's been all sorts of scandals, but in principle, for example, I mean, banks are not supposed to be involved in the narco trade. Now, in the early 80s, I know this very well, certain banks in Florida, especially around Miami, were very clearly getting very involved in laundering money for drug cartels, like the Colombian cartel. And this was eventually dealt with, And even today, if you look at like the Panama Papers, I mean, there are things going on today where we're still not doing things right, but they have to hide it. It's not a blatant thing. So I think the Iron Bank can't blatantly, turn around. And I think because of our culture, because of most of these people are Braavosi, especially the key holders. The key holders are sort of the shareholders in the bank, I guess. Because they have this history, I find it hard to imagine that the Iron Bank will ever openly or as a matter of policy be involved in slave trade. However, slaves in other areas, like, we talk here about Moorish lace and Moorish lenses. I mean, who says that a lot of these high-level products are not produced by slaves? Somewhere along the line, money that the Iron Bank invests in Essos will end up somehow getting out into a slave trade. So, to pull back a bit, and let's say not does the Iron Bank directly invest, because I'm pretty certain they don't, and I think to some degree, some of the Iron Bank, I suspect the Iron Bank, some of it is aligned with the whole anti-slavery thing, and it's probably to some degree sometimes choosing investments based on, we're encouraging people to create a different approach to things or what have you. But can we say at least, does the Iron Bank at least acknowledge or recognize the fact that, I mean, would it be impacted, let me put it this way, would it be impacted by the disruption that Danny introduces in the slave trade by especially in Astapor and Marine? And would it, well, yes, there would be some sort of knock-on effect because of the fact that their money is so, they lend to a guy who ships goods from Braavos to the Seven Kingdoms, and then he takes us goods from the Seven Kingdoms, and he goes off to Volantis. And now he doesn't buy slaves, but he buys Volantine glass, which he takes on to somewhere else, and so on. Well, that Volantine glass is being produced by some glass-making factory staffed by slaves. This sort of thing will have an impact on them. If suddenly there's no glass because the slaves have revolted, that guy won't be able to pay back his loan. But because of the fact that it's so diffuse in some ways, I don't know if a direct impact will have an effect on them in sort of an immediate or terrible way. And I think it would be a more diffuse and sort of, they notice it more or less. But on the other hand, do they care? I mean, obviously it's money. They care, but they're not getting their money, and they can go to great lengths to get back their money. But someone raised a good point. I mean, slavery, why isn't it practiced in the West anymore? Why isn't, by the main of society? I mean, there are stories of, even today, there are slaves, even in the United States, there are people who are essentially living in slavery. I read a story about a writer, I think in Seattle, who passed away recently. I think it was Seattle, and then or maybe California, and he revealed after the fact that basically this woman who had lived with his family all his life and who he took care of, and was sort of, she was essentially a slave who was given to his parents, and basically it's fascinating. But so, okay, it still exists. I don't want to, but basically the Western economies industry aren't really based on slavery. Even if you look at Asia, where a lot of the international trade is going on, you have sweatshops and things, and yes, there's horrible conditions, and yes, there's probably some slavery, but it's improving because in the end, it's not a very efficient way of doing things. The reason it didn't continue on today in the wider scale as being a foundational aspect of modern economies is it's not efficient, it's not an effective way to manage labor, to produce goods. It's too many things are wrong about it. So the Iron Bank would surely want to see greater efficiencies in the marketplace, because that means its money has more impact and it will earn more. And because they have this anti-slavery foundation, even if the Iron Bankers are cold-blooded pragmatists who only care about money, they're familiar enough with the idea of slavery is not being good, but they would surely see a disruption as, yeah, in the short term this hurts, in the long term it's great. Consider, in Marine, you have these weaver women who were former slaves, and their former owner wants them to recompense him for the training that he gave. They had learned from an old woman who was a master weaver that he owned, but now that they were free, they struck out on their own, and he wanted to be recompensed for the education and the start he gave them. These women are going to be women who will want to raise money for a loom and textiles and things to do their work. The sudden freeing of so many slaves, many unskilled, some skilled, would actually potentially open a whole new area of investment for the Iron Bank. There would be people forming, the first guilds would be forming in Marine and Fury for various aspects of trade, and they will want to be able to help start up their guild in a fusion of money of people who are former slaves. I mean, the Iron Bank in the long terms should really be celebrating this. So the show, I mean, as usual, the show really simplifies things, and I think you can always kind of wish that they had. I wish they had given a different impression, but they didn't feel like they had to tie the Iron Bank's concerns with Daenerys to being solely about the impact on the slave trade, because it gives the wrong impression of Braavos. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe they've just, I mean, to me, they've just kind of changed the fundamental aspect. I mean, it's possible they just, who cares? Braavos does slaves as well, and they just changed a fundamental aspect of Braavos, or at least of the Iron Bank, to make it easy for them to convey some sort of basic conflict. It's one of the reasons I stopped watching the show, because to me, I would have crafted it a little differently, and he said, oh, well, it's not as clear why we're opposed to Dany if you don't do this and that. Well, who cares if it's clear or not? Ultimately, the end point is we're not with her, so you can say pretty much anything. So why not say the thing that at least fits most with the setting and doesn't change details unnecessarily? So in any case, would the Iron Bank invest in slaves? I think not, but indirectly, it's impossible for the Iron Bank's money not to be involved and in the slave trade. And would it bother them that slave trade has been impacted by Daenerys? I think not. I mean, I think maybe someone in the short term might go, darn it, we're losing so much. But I think in the long term, I think the Iron Bank would be foolish not to understand that this is actually probably a great thing. And those are my thoughts on the Iron Bank and the slave trade. Maybe I suggested I do another one of these, so maybe I'll toss one of those out next week.